Hi East Bears, it's Dr. Dennison here. Let's read our third article together. This is reading number 3 from the packet. This is the packet that KCPS distributed online and on paper through the mail. I included the tasks from the packet and added a couple more just to give you guys some more point opportunities. So here's a Google Doc where you can record your answers. After we read the article, you'll take the quiz, write your quiz answers there, list 3 of the most interesting things you learned, and explain why each is interesting to you. And then write a 2-paragraph letter to the editor arguing against colonialism. Cite 3 examples from the text of its negative impacts on societies. So this article is about colonialism in Southeast Asia. Oh, look what Dr. D has right here. A globe. Shocking, right? All right, so history of Western colonial rule in Southeast Asia. Here's our globe. All right, here's the United States. We're going to go east across Europe into Asia, and we're going to go to Southeast Asia. And this whole area down here is what's called Southeast Asia. Okay? And Western colonial rule, those were people from the West who were doing the colonizing, mostly Europeans and some Americans. During this time, this is when the United States really started to become a major player on the world stage. Okay, let's jump right in. Here's an image. I'm going to read the caption. The arrival of British forces in Mandalay, Myanmar, or Burma's second largest city. This photo was taken by Willoughby Wallace Cooper in 1885. Western dominance. So remember, the West, Europe, and the United States. The expansion of Western colonial rule in most of Southeast Asia was mostly a phenomenon of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. In the earlier period, Europeans tended to acquire or get territory as a result of complicated and not always desired entanglements with Southeast Asian powers, either in disputes or as a result of alliances. Map. After about 1850, Western forces were generally more invasive, requiring little justification for attacking. The most important reasons for the change were a growing Western technological superiority, an increasingly powerful European commercial community in Southeast Asia, and a competitive scramble for strategic territory. Only Siam remained largely intact and independent. By 1886, the rest of the region had been divided among the British, French, Dutch, and Spanish. In 1898, after the U.S. won the Spanish-American War, it took Spain's colonies of Guam and the Philippine Islands. The Portuguese still hung to the island of Timor. What were often called pacification campaigns were actually colonial wars, notably in Burma, Myanmar, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Indonesia. These continued well into the 20th century. More peaceful Western advancements on local independence also occurred until the 1920s. Full-blown modern colonial states existed for only a short period, in many cases for not much more than a generation. These colonial regimes, however, were not useless. They put down strong governmental roots and, though often taking over existing forms of government, formed centralized, disciplined structures of great power. They were backed by the enormous economic resources of the industrialized Western nations. By the early 20th century, having effectively disarmed the indigenous societies there before them, they dominated in warfare. There is no mistaking the impact of Western colonial governments on their surroundings. Nowhere is this more evident than in the economy. Production of tin, oil, rubber, sugar, rice, tobacco, coffee, tea, and other commodities grew, driven by both government and private activity. This brought rapid changes to the physical and human landscape and coupled Southeast Asia to a new worldwide capitalist system. Indeed, colonial domination was part of a rapidly changing world. For years, the territory of Siam, through a combination of circumstance and the wide leadership of Mongkut, ruled 1851 to 1868, and Chulalongkorn from 1868 to 1910, avoided Western rule. Nevertheless, Siam was forced to adopt policies similar to those of the colonial powers in order to survive. Modernization appeared to require such an approach, and the Thai did not hesitate to embrace it with enthusiasm. Bangkok in the late 1920s was a center of such modern amenities as electric lighting and medical facilities. The state itself had achieved an inevitable degree of political and economic strength among its colonial neighbors. The Thai may have colonized themselves, as some critics noted. Still, in so doing, they also escaped or lessened some of the more destructive characteristics of Western rule, among them racism and colonial destruction. They also do not appear to have experienced the same degree of rural unrest that troubled their colonial neighbors in the 1920s and 30s. They were unable, however, to avoid other ill effects of state expansion and modernization. Transformation of state and society. It was not the purpose of the new states to cause rapid or broad social change. Their primary concerns were extending bureaucratic control and creating the conditions for success in a capitalist world economy. The chief necessity was stability and order. Boundaries were drawn, villages defined, laws rewritten, all along Western lines of understanding, often completely disregarding the indigenous views and practices. The new structure swiftly replaced the old. Social change was desired only in the sense it might strengthen these activities. Thus, the Thai began early on to send princes to Europe for their education, employing them throughout the government on their return. The Dutch created exclusive schools for the indigenous administrative elite, a kind of petty royalty. The Dutch invented ways of reducing social mobility in this group, like, for example, by making important positions passed down to only certain family members. But the new governments did not provide Western-style learning to most Southeast Asians. Mostly this is because it was an enormous, difficult, and expensive task, and also because policymakers worried about the social and political consequences of creating an educated class. Except in the Philippines, by the mid-1930s, only a few indigenous children attended government-run schools, and only a fraction of those studied above the primary school level. Some Southeast Asian intellectuals soon drew the conclusion that they had better educate themselves. They began establishing their own schools with modern courses of study not tied to religious teaching. Some, like the Tonkin Free School in Vietnam in 1907, were closed by colonial regimes, their staffs and pupils hounded by the police. Others, like the many so-called, quote, wild schools in Indonesia in the 1930s, were much too numerous to do away with altogether, but they were controlled as carefully as possible. Nevertheless, during the 1920s and 30s, a tiny but thoughtful and active class of westernized Southeast Asian intellectuals appeared. They were not the first to speak the language of the colonial rulers and criticize them, for by the 20th century, Java and Luzon, with the longest experience under Western rule, had already produced individuals like the Javanese noblewoman Raden Ajaning Kartini and the Filipino patriot Jose Rizal. The newer generation, however, was more certain in its opposition to colonial rule, clearer and far more political in its conception of a nation. It was determined to seize leadership and initiative in their own societies. In Burma, this group called themselves Thakin, Burmese for master. This was both a sarcastic and proud use of an indigenous word that had been reserved for Burmese to employ when addressing or describing Europeans. These new intellectuals were not so much anti-Western as they were anti-colonial. They accepted the existing state as the foundation of a modern nation, which they, rather than colonial officials, would control. This was the generation that captained the struggles for independence. In Siam, it was independence from the monarchy, and emerged in the post-World War II era as national leaders. The best-known figures are Sukarno of Indonesia, Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam, and U Nu of Burma, later Myanmar. The chief problem facing the new intellectuals lay in reaching and influencing the wider population. Colonial efforts feared this and worked to prevent it. Another obstacle was that ordinary people, especially outside cities and towns, inhabited a different social and cultural world from that of the emerging leaders. Communication was difficult, particularly when it came to explaining such concepts as nationalism and modernization. Still, despite Western disbelief, there was considerable resentment of colonial rule at the lower levels of society. This was based largely on perceptions that taxes were too numerous and too high, bureaucratic control too tight and too prone to corruption, and laborers dealt with too forcefully and unfairly. In many areas, there was also deep-seated hatred of control by foreigners, whether they be the Europeans themselves or the Chinese, Indians, or others who were perceived as creatures of their rule. Most of the newly intellectual elite were only vaguely aware of these sentiments, which in any case frequently made them uneasy. In a sense, too, they were foreigners. In the 1930s, a series of anti-colonial revolts took place in Burma, Vietnam, and the Philippines. Though they failed in their objectives, these revolts made it clear that among the masses lay considerable dissatisfaction and therefore radical potential. The revolts and economic disarray of the Great Depression also suggested that European rule was neither invulnerable nor without flaws. The outbreak of war in Europe and the Pacific showed that the colonial powers were much weaker militarily than had been imagined, soon destroying colonial rule and harnessing the power of the masses seemed for the first time to be real possibilities. Thank you for reading along with me. See you next time.